So we know that if you've got 1,000 and you divide it by 10, you'll get 100. 100 divided by 10, you'll get 10. 10 divided by 10, you'll get 1. And all you need to know about decimals is that it just keeps on going. So if you've got 1 of something and you divide it into 10 pieces, you'll have 1/10. And tenths, because they're less than 1, they go after the decimal point. So if you've got 1 of something, say 1 rectangle here, and you've divided it into 10 pieces, and you've got 1 of these parts out of 10, then you've got 1/10, and as a decimal, you would write that 0.1 because the first column after the decimal point is the tenths column. If you had 2/10, you would have 0.2. If you had 3/10, you'd have 0.3, and so on. Now 1/100th, or 1 over 100, that's where we use the second place value column after the decimal point. So if you've got 1 over 100, you've got 0.01. So we get 100th when we divide a whole, say a whole rectangle, into 100, or when you divide a tenth by 10. Remember what I said at the beginning, that as you go along the place values, it gets 10 times smaller. Well, if we had a tenth, and then we chopped that tenth into 10 pieces, and only kept 1 of them, we would have 1/100th. And as before, if you had 200ths, it would be 0.02, 300ths, 0.03, and so on. Now the third place value column after the decimal point is the thousandths column. So you can imagine a whole of something, so a whole rectangle divided into 1,000 pieces. If you only had 1 of those pieces, you would have 1/1000th, or 0.01. So we get 1,000th when we divide a whole by 1,000, or when we divide 100th by 10. So if you think back, this was 100th. If we chopped it up into 10 pieces and only kept 1 of those pieces, we would have 1/1000th. And as before, if we had 2 of those pieces, we would have 2/1000ths, or 0.002. If we had 3/1000ths, it would be 0.003, and so on. And you can see 1,000th, when we're talking about thousandths, we're talking usually about something that's really, really tiny. So 1,000th of this rectangle is so small an area of it that you can only just about see it. So if you've got a decimal number like 0.007, because the 7 is the third decimal, is the third place value after the decimal point, that tells you that you've got 7/1000ths. If you've got 0.028, that tells you that you've got 200ths, because you've got 2 in the hundredths column, and then you've got 8/1000ths as well. 1.063 says that you've got 1 whole of something. You've not got any tenths, so that 0 is important because it tells you that you've not got any tenths, but you do have 600ths and 3/1000ths. Now 0.421 means you've got 4/10ths, and then you've got 200ths, and you've also got 1/1000th. Now 0.999 means you've got 9/10ths, you've got 900ths, and you've got 9/1000ths. So if you had 1 more thousandth, you would have a whole. Because if you imagine the rectangles that we looked at earlier, if you had 9/10ths of that rectangle shaded, and then you had another 9/100ths and another 9/1000ths, there would only be one tiny little missing piece, one more 1000th needed to fill up the whole of the rectangle.